Ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues, let me begin with a question. Why do the headlines today seem obsessed with military posturing rather than the real economic issues at stake? When we hear about troops mobilizing, missiles deployed, and tense standoffs between nations, like the current situation between the United States and Venezuela, what are we really being shown? And what is being left out? Is this a story of national security alone, or is it a story about power, resources, and the economic interests that drive political decisions? First, let's take a step back. Venezuela has been in a prolonged economic crisis, with its oil resources at the center of global attention. The United States, for decades, has maintained a strategic interest in this region, often invoking ideals of democracy and stability. But we must ask, whose stability, whose democracy? When economic sanctions are imposed or military posturing is highlighted, the consequences are most keenly felt by ordinary citizens, not the political or corporate elites who often benefit from such conflicts. Now, consider the framing of troops and missiles. Headlines suggest imminent danger, yet rarely do they explore the underlying structures, economic sanctions, international debt obligations, debts, and control over critical resources that make confrontation more likely. This is not just a matter of one nation threatening another. It is a reflection of a global system where economic power and military power are tightly intertwined. Corporations, banks, and political elites operate within this system, influencing policy decisions while ordinary people bear the cost. Moreover, it is important to examine the role of perception. Militarized rhetoric can rally domestic support, distract from domestic economic challenges, and create the illusion of external threats. Meanwhile, questions about economic inequality, the management of public resources, and the broader social consequences of these policies are often sidelined. As students of political economy, we must ask, are we responding to real threats or to manufactured narratives that protect the interests of those already in power? When we examine the tensions between the United States and Venezuela, it is tempting to frame the situation as a simple matter of national security or diplomatic disagreement. Yet if we pause and ask ourselves a deeper question, why now and why with such intensity, we begin to see that the issue is not merely political, but profoundly economic. Venezuela sits atop one of the world's largest reserves of oil, a resource that has historically been central to global energy markets. This is not a trivial detail. Energy is the lifeblood of industrial economies, and control over it confers both strategic and financial leverage. The question we must ask is, when nations posture militarily, are they really preparing for conflict, or are they asserting control over economic assets that shape the global balance of power? Consider the history of foreign intervention in resource-rich nations. Time and again, strategic interests in oil, minerals, or other natural resources have motivated policy far more than abstract ideals of democracy or human rights. In Venezuela's case, international sanctions and diplomatic pressure are often presented as moral imperatives intended to defend democratic principles. Yet beneath these narratives lies a complex web of economic incentives. Companies and investors, many of them based in the United States, stand to gain from the disruption or restructuring of Venezuelan resource management. When we read headlines about threats, missile deployments, and troop movements, we must critically ask who benefits from this tension and at whose expense. The economic stakes are enormous. Venezuela's oil reserves, while underproduced due to domestic and international challenges, remain a potentially lucrative asset in the global market. Controlling access to these reserves can influence not just local wealth, but international energy prices and supply chains. It is easy to overlook in the heat of news cycles that military posturing is often inseparable from these underlying economic calculations. The presence of troops or talk of readiness functions as leverage, signaling both to domestic and international audiences that the nation is prepared to defend or acquire assets of strategic value. One must ask, is this really about conflict or about control disguised as security? Equally important is the broader context of global power structures. The United States, as a leading economic and military actor, has long shaped policies in ways that favor its corporate and financial interests abroad. When we examine interventions or diplomatic pressure in nations rich in natural resources, a pattern emerges. Political narratives of protection or democracy often mask the pursuit of economic advantage. Venezuela is not an isolated case. It reflects a systemic dynamic in which access to wealth, resources, and markets informs foreign policy decisions, often in ways invisible to the public eye. The economic imperative drives the rhetoric of security, creating a story that is dramatic, urgent, and attention-grabbing, precisely what news media can amplify. Yet the economic angle does not only concern elites or corporations, it has profound consequences for ordinary citizens. Policies shaped by resource control and strategic interest frequently produce hardship for the local population, including shortages, inflation, and social instability. The people of Venezuela experience the tangible effects of international economic maneuvering, while the abstract headlines of troop readiness fail to capture this reality. Here is where critical analysis becomes essential. To understand global events, we cannot accept the surface narrative of military standoffs alone. We must interrogate the economic structures and incentives that underpin these actions. Finally, we should recognize that the stakes of these economic considerations extend beyond national borders. Resource access, market stability, and corporate interests are interconnected globally. Decisions made in Washington or in Caracas ripple across international economies, influencing energy prices, trade agreements, and financial markets worldwide. By asking the right questions, who profits, who loses, and why now, we uncover the economic currents beneath the surface of geopolitical conflict, revealing a pattern of power and influence that is far more enduring than the immediate threat of missiles or troops. When we hear about sanctions imposed on Venezuela, the headlines often describe them as tools of diplomacy or instruments to pressure the government into compliance with international norms. But we must ask ourselves a fundamental question: pressure whom exactly? Rarely do the stories highlight the people who bear the brunt of these measures, the ordinary citizens whose lives are disrupted, whose access to essential goods and services is curtailed, and whose daily survival becomes increasingly precarious. Sanctions are frequently framed as targeting political elites or regimes, yet the reality is far more complicated and, in many cases, far more tragic. Sanctions function not merely as a symbolic gesture of international displeasure. They operate by restricting financial transactions, limiting trade, and curbing access to essential resources. At first glance, this may seem like a focused approach aimed at the corridors of power, but the infrastructure of an economy is interconnected. When a country is blocked from participating in international trade, its industries falter, imports of critical goods dwindle, and inflation skyrockets. Ordinary citizens, particularly those who rely on public services and affordable necessities, feel the impact most acutely. Hospitals struggle to obtain medicine, schools operate with limited resources, and families face the rising cost of basic food. So we must ask, are sanctions truly a targeted diplomatic tool, or are they an economic sledgehammer with indiscriminate consequences? Consider the broader political narrative often presented. Sanctions are framed as a moral or principled stance, a way to compel governments to respect democracy or human rights. Yet these measures frequently fail to reach the intended political targets in a meaningful way. Political elites often have alternative channels, reserves, or international connections that allow them to mitigate the sanctions' effects, while the population, teachers, nurses, farmers, factory workers, struggles under the weight of economic deprivation. This disparity raises crucial ethical questions about the design and impact of foreign policy. When a policy is intended to influence a government, what level of human cost is considered acceptable, and who decides this? Sanctions also exacerbate existing structural vulnerabilities within the economy. Venezuela's reliance on oil exports, for example, makes it particularly susceptible to financial restrictions imposed by external actors. When revenue streams are blocked or limited, public investment in infrastructure, health, and education is reduced, creating cascading effects that impact every corner of society. In other words, what appears as a targeted political measure becomes a widespread economic crisis, disproportionately harming the most vulnerable. The ordinary citizens are not incidental casualties. They are the unavoidable consequence of a system where economic leverage is used as a tool of political strategy. Moreover, sanctions are rarely isolated in their impact. They intersect with domestic economic mismanagement, global market fluctuations, and climate-related challenges, amplifying hardships for the population. The people caught in this web face the paradox of being held responsible for the decisions of distant policymakers over which they have no control. And yet, these are the same individuals often portrayed as passive or silent in news coverage. Their voice is lost amidst rhetoric of sanctions, diplomacy, and international strategy. If we truly want to understand the human dimension of global policy, should we not focus on those whose lives are directly disrupted rather than only the headlines? Finally, it is essential to recognize that sanctions, while often framed as moral or strategic tools, are fundamentally economic weapons. They highlight the power asymmetry between nations